I come back, unfortunately, there's an emergency that I have to run to, and then I'll return thereafter. I now yield to Ranking Member McCall. You're on mute, Mr. McCall. You have to unmute, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say great event last night with the hunger awards and our malnutrition bill. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank the panelists for being here today. Our engagement on the African continent must be a partnership of shared economic, security, political, and development objectives. While the U.S. offers partnership, the PRC and Russia seek to leverage their offers of financing or security guarantees for their own political, economic, and security priorities. Perfect example of this is the CCP's debt trap diplomacy through their Belt and Road Initiative. When I meet with partners and allies around the world, I ask why they are entering into dangerous agreements with the Chinese Communist Party, and they tell me it's because we're not there. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, we're not on the field. We got to be on the field if we're going to win. The U.S. government needs to show up and compete. And by 2050, 25% of the world's population will live in Africa. And over 60% of the continent is under the age of 30. These trends pose both incredible opportunities, but also immense challenges. These young people need education, employment, and opportunity to create a better life for themselves. And that's why strategic investments now by the U.S. to partner with African nations to address these challenges is so critical. This is, I want to mention the AGOA Forum. This is congressionally mandated, and it's to bring trade ministers from eligible countries to discuss trade and investment opportunities. I think we need to promote a two-way trade and investment with the continent, and it must be a top priority. I'm proud of the bill I introduced, the Championing American Businesses Through Diplomacy Act that was signed into law. And earlier this year, I introduced legislation to codify the Prosper African Initiative. This effort coordinates the various tools of the U.S. government, like the Development Finance Corporation, Millennium Challenge Corporation, USAID, and Department of Commerce, to speak with one voice and support companies looking to invest in Africa. Despite promises that Africa would be a priority, I'm seeing the administration not really rising to the challenge. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, you and I can work to make that a priority. I have to say that Africa is going to be, again, the continent to focus on. You know, as we met with David Beasley, who testified yesterday about the global famine that we may see impact the continent of Africa, and how it could impact the Sahel, and how it could impact the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and threats. We need to, as the Global Fragility Bill, as we pass that bill, to stabilize the continent of Africa. If Africa becomes destabilized, it becomes dangerous. And I think it's our goal, Mr. Chairman, to stabilize Africa and make it a land of opportunity and not a land of threats. And I want to thank you for putting this roundtable together. And I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, on this very important issue. And thank you for doing this. And thanks to the panelists. I yield back.
Hello, hi, I'm Congresswoman Karen Bass. I believe the chairman has departed for a few minutes, but I want to thank our panelists for joining us for this roundtable on reimagining the U.S. approach to Africa. As those in attendance, all of us are aware, Africa is the youngest and fastest growing continent. In the coming year, there will be endless social, cultural, and economic opportunities for multilateral engagement and partnership that will benefit not only the continent, but also the rest of the world. However, Africa is facing many challenges. that hinder its continued socio-economic development and prevent African countries from meeting their full potential, like climate change, for example, are the lack of infrastructure, including electricity and roads, that frankly contribute to ethnic conflict, terrorism, food insecurity, and democratic backsliding. So far, the traditional approach by the United States to engaging with Africa has focused largely on delivering humanitarian assistance when it is urgently needed, rather than supporting African-led programs and strategies that promote long-term development and self-sustainability on the continent, such as assisting in structural development like infrastructure. So therein lies the problem. The conversation we're having today is an important step towards shifting the narrative from seeing Africa as a continent in need towards seeing it as a continent with significant opportunities for mutually beneficial collaboration that bolsters Africa's self-reliance. In other words, the United States must stop reactively and unilaterally responding to crises in Africa and start proactively building institutions and implementing programs with African partners in a multilateral fashion that encourages enduring socio-economic progress. This morning, I look forward to hearing from panelists about how we can work together with other democratic countries and with African entrepreneurs to support new investment opportunities, and with African entrepreneurs that will help expand manufacturing and production by using natural resources on the continent and while strengthening capacities for regional and international trade. In the same vein, I hope we can have a discussion on how African lands and farming can help solve the food and security crisis that has persisted in Africa for decades and is being further exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Actually, the war in Ukraine maybe presents an opportunity to expedite us addressing this problem in terms of increasing Africa's capacity to meet its needs. And given rising Chinese and Russian influence on the continent, it is also important that we discuss how democratic world powers can engage with Africa in a way that signals long-lasting interest in strengthening social-economic ties rather than extracting resources and amassing geopolitical power. But most importantly, I'm glad this roundtable has brought together several different perspectives from across the globe for a conversation about how we can work together to propel African development and permanently raise standards of living. I'm excited to learn what insights you've gained from your various experiences so that we might find solutions to the obstacles that are standing in the way of Africa's development. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce our first presenter. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala took office as the World Trade Office Director General on March of 2021. She is a global finance expert, an economist and international development professional with over 30 years of experience working in Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and North America. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Bass, and it's such a pleasure to see you and to be here with you today. I want to start by thanking Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, and to say a shout out to all the other congressmen and women here, and to the House Foreign Affairs Committee staffers who also set this up, and my fellow panelists. I'm really delighted to join you today to discuss such an important topic. Let me start by saying that I have one message today. If the United States wants to lead a multilateral approach to support Africans in realizing the continent's potential, it needs to move from an aid mindset to a trade and investment mindset. From Prosper Africa to Power Africa to the recent joint regional strategy, I know there's a move in the right direction, but the pace needs to be speeded up. It needs to be faster, and we need to match words with action and resources in order to make things move. Between COVID-19 and the fallout from the war in Ukraine, African economies have lost an enormous amount of ground. International trade and investment will be critical for helping Africa regain and surpass pre-pandemic trends. GDP growth in sub-Saharan Africa since 2020 has been roughly in line with the world average at just below 2% per year. But our economies need to grow much faster than that to lift per capita incomes and to make a dent in poverty. The African Development Bank estimates it will take over a decade to bring poverty rates back to pre-pandemic levels. The World Bank calculates that the pandemic, inflation, and the war in Ukraine will push 25 million more additional people in sub-Saharan Africa into extreme poverty. The United Nations estimates that 278 million people on the continent were already undernourished in 2021, a number that has surely increased alongside food price inflation. Pandemic-related school closures have led to substantial learning and literacy loss, particularly for girls. This is bad news for millions of young people and for future growth prospects. These setbacks are mirrored in global trade. Preliminary World Trade Organization data for the first quarter of 2022 show that while global merchandise trade volumes were 6% higher than in the final quarter of 2019, African trade is more than 4% lower than where it was back then. Africa's already low 2.4% share of world trade is decreasing. And costs of trade, we know, are high. We have estimated about a 300% plus tariff as additional cost of African trade, which is 50% higher than that in developed countries. So slow growth, high costs, weak exports, high inflation, and tightening financial conditions at home and abroad are making debt burdens worse and raising the risk of capital flight and severe exchange rate depreciation on the continent. As of May, 7 low-income African countries were already in debt distress, according to the IMF, and over 30 more were at high or moderate risk of debt distress. All this is exacerbated by insecurity, especially in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, problems that themselves are being made worse by climate change. Hidden among these challenges, though, are opportunities that the US can seize in recalibrating its Africa strategy. Like the US objectives, African countries also want to promote sustainable prosperity, democracy, and security, and the opportunities are there to do that. The US policy for Africa articulated by the Biden administration recognizes these opportunities. As Molly Fee, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, said last December, and I quote, "Expanding Africa's economic power is good for Africans and it's good for Americans. We also need to look around the corner when Africa's young people will be the global workforce of the future," close quotes. Economies on the continent need to grow faster and trade more. Leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area and its market of 1.4 billion people to create regional and global value chains and add more value to goods and services would help to boost Africa's share of global trade from its current 2.4%. With a median age of under 20, Africa will have a young and potentially productive workforce as populations age rapidly elsewhere, a real demographic advantage, even with the rise of automation. Growing climate risks and fragilities exposed by the pandemic and the war have led to a push for supply chain nearshoring and friendshoring to achieve greater resilience and diversification. This push, which should be about deconcentration, not deglobalization, creates a major opportunity for Africa to become a bigger part of global production networks, to build regional and global value chains for pharmaceuticals, for agricultural products such as fertilizers and other inputs, and generally to add more value to its commodity exports. Re-globalizing Africa, by which I mean bringing African countries, companies, and workers from the margins of the global division of labor to the center of it, would be good for poverty reduction and growth on the continent. It would make Africa a bigger market for US businesses, and it would make global markets more resilient in future crises. The time could not be more right for the US government and private sector to invest in Africa. Security is a prerequisite for sustainable prosperity, and the flow of arms out of Libya and elsewhere to bandits and Islamic radicals in the Sahel needs to be brought under control. But much more needs to be done on trade and investment. And the data make clear that the US has lost the head start it had over China. In 2001, 16.6% of African merchandise exports in value terms went to the United States. Only 2.8% went to China. By 2021, 17.2% of African exports went to China, while 6.6% went to the US. Over that time, African exports to the US increased by 64% to $36 billion, but exports to China increased over 23 times to $94 billion. A similar trend can be seen on the import side. In 2001, 8.7% of African imports came from the United States, more than double the share from China. In 2021, almost 21% of African imports came from China, about 4 times the share from the US. Between 2000 and 2020, Chinese financiers signed loan commitments with African governments and state-owned enterprises worth $160 billion, according to the Chinese loans database at Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The same database estimates that 29% of the Chinese loan commitments went to the transportation sector and 25% to the power sector, together covering infrastructure development projects such as railways, roads, ports, airports, power plants, and transmission lines. Whilst these loans may be leading to debt distress in several African countries and are not a panacea, they address some of the critical infrastructure deficits confronting the continent. US private and public sector must recognize this infrastructure gap and help Africans address it, going beyond the Power Africa initiative to drive more resources to address these issues, in particular, seizing the opportunity now offered by renewables and by gas as a transitional source of energy. I know that the US is moving in the right direction and trying to close this gap. At the G7 summit in Germany last month, the US and its partners announced an initiative to mobilize $600 billion by 2027 in global infrastructure investments, a good chunk of which would go to Africa. Such funding would make a real difference, as Africa cannot grow unless it has the required infrastructure base. We need to invest in this faster and quicker. The African Growth and Opportunity Act of AGOA was a visionary trade policy and needs to be built upon. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers a strong potential for building this up. Even though the US is now playing catch-up, it remains liked and respected as a preferred partner on the continent. I'm convinced that if the US redirects its policies, Africans will be open to it. Let me conclude by saying that building more prosperity across the continent will strengthen democracy. Acting promptly to help improve security and governance issues will help rebuild prosperity. So we need one in order to build a cascade for the other. We know what to do. The US has the instruments to take the required action. It is imperative now that the US use all these instruments to spur action from both the public and private sector to get Africa's development moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me introduce our next speakers. Donald Kaberuka is a Rwandan economist and former finance minister who served as the 7th president of the African Development Bank. He is credited for expanding the reach and impact of the Development Bank, Africa's premier financial institution, during his 2 years as president. Kaberuka is currently the African Union's High Representative for Financing the Peace Fund and the COVID-19 response. Ambassador Rama Yade is Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and Senior Fellow for the Europe Center. Prior to joining the Council, she was a consultant for the World Bank, advising the institution on education, youth, sports, human capital, and disability issues in Africa. Todd Moss is founder and executive director of the Energy for Growth Hub. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute and at the Colorado School of Mines Payne Institute. I would like to ask our speakers to begin, and I don't see a clock on the screen, but if you could keep your comments to 5 minutes, and then after we will open up for members' questions. Thank you. Mr. Kaberuka.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Karen Bass. I'll stick to my 5 minutes. Thank you for inviting me to the roundtable. I'm happy to join my colleagues, panelists. My first point, we are truly living in exceptional times. In the last 15 years alone, Africa has seen 5 successive crises in different regions of Africa. The global financial crisis, Ebola, the Arab Spring, COVID, and now Ukraine, in successive years. Now, I have not mentioned the ongoing existential issues of climate, to which I must add biodiversity and desertification, which Ngozi referred to. And of course, the peace and security conundrum in the Sahel, the Horn, and Libya. These are crises which have had vast human and economic consequences. 10 years ago, there was a narrative which we discussed in Washington at one of the summits called Africa Rising. It was not wholly unwarranted, but neither was it wholly accurate. It was a mixed bag, a mixed picture across our 55 countries. What is true, though, is that for the first time since the 2 oil crises in the 1970s, African economies had begun at last a trend of converging with the rest of the world. Real per capita incomes were positive in most places, not all. Economic growth was beginning to catch up with demographics. We know, of course, that economic growth was strong. In fact, as you said, Madam Ngozi, Africa was the second fastest growing continent at the time. We know that economic growth is not the same thing as economic transformation. There were issues with jobs, there were issues of continued dependence on commodities, inequalities, and so on. So we fully understood that. Still, Africa was turning a corner. The risk now we face is that another long period of divergence and stagflation, debt, disease burden reverses all that. Now, someone has said that the COVID crisis stress tested 3 things. One, our health systems all over the world, in rich and poor countries, our governance systems in rich and poor countries, and our social cohesion. That is certainly true. And as Africa dealt with these crises, the continent, its own people, did their very best on their own to try and deal with these issues. But there was a very tough choice between the rock and the hard place, saving lives and livelihoods, and doing so in a world of inequalities, of which I think the global shortfall on vaccine, which all of us know about, was a manifestation. It is not the place for me to apportion blame. It was a collective deficit, which is a manifestation of the differences in global equity. And as the continent now addresses these issues, it now has to do with energy, food, and supply chains issues emanating from the issues of Eastern Europe. It is truly a turning point since 75 years. The multilateral system, which was meant to deal with such issues, is shaken to its very foundation. And many nations in the global south and Africa are reeling from the consequences. Let me add here one thing, Chair, that throughout all these crises, Africa has not stood aside waiting for external help or charity. Far from it. African countries, African institutions, the African Union have rose to the occasion. I could even say that when it comes to COVID, many countries in Africa were actually exemplars. Here I refer to the initiatives of the African Union, like vaccine acquisition, the medical platform, and the stellar performance of the Africa Center for Disease Control. I say all this, Chair, because I don't want to give an impression, which is sometimes generated, that Africa is waiting for charity or help from outside. The continent itself is able to do things on its own, but it needs cooperation. It needs partnership. I believe that in the constellation of how the US can support an ambitious multilateral engagement in Africa, this would be a very good place to begin. How about beginning to support Africa's own efforts, Africa's own institutions, instead of looking for a tabula rasa of what the US can do for Africa? Let me just mention a few and then becoming close to closing my remarks. How about working with the Center for Disease Control, NADIS, to ensure that we can prevent, we can anticipate, we can respond to pandemics when they come, building on the excellent programs the US, like PEPFAR, the malaria program, etc. How about supporting a robust replenishment of the Global Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis? And I really want to thank President Joe Biden and the administration, who will be hosting the Global Fund in New York in September, for the initiatives in this area. And even though Greg Meeks is not here, I know he has done quite a lot on your behalf to get the administration to respond adequately to that particular challenge. So thank you, Greg, for what you have done. I believe that without you, we would not have been here. But we look forward very much to this replenishment meeting in New York in September.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. Ambassador Yade?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And congratulations to Chairman Meeks and Representative Bass for this important event. Greetings, the Congress people and my co-panelists. I would like to talk today to you about the importance of African creative industries and why it should be at the center of any policy or investment strategy to Africa. When I have been appointed director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center last year, I have placed this topic at the heart of our action at the same level as security and economy. Fashion, movies, visual arts, cultural sites, media, design, arts, or even sports, gaming, books. You know, Africa is experiencing an exceptional cultural revolution. I used to be a French minister and French ambassador, but I was also born in Africa. And from democracy to food insecurity, from migrations to climate, all the speeches around Africa in Western countries are always pessimistic and negative. This African bias is reflected in the prime risks the markets apply, the financial markets apply to African countries, despite their economic performances. That is the first secret of the Chinese success in Africa. And at the Atlantic Council, we have now a huge program on Africa creative industries, and the signature is the Africa Creative Industries Summit of Washington in the Smithsonian Museums, and it is also decentralized in African city capitals. And the idea here is to highlight the opportunities of investment there, but also why it is so important. It's not only about fun or entertainment. It's about soft power. It's about African leadership. It's about connection between the African diasporas everywhere in the world, including the US. It's about a promising economic market promising for job creation in the youngest continent of the world. And it's also about security through digital currencies and digital infrastructure. It is a critically strategic matter. African cultural soft power has always existed. We know that African heritage is everywhere in music, in blues, in salsa, in rap, reggae, and even disco, in painting through Picasso, in the pyramids of Egypt, and the sculptures of ancient Greece, of course. And we see African luxury fashion has been renewed with African inspirations, African fashion weeks, Netflix and Disney have greatly enriched their platform with African series. And the most important or rentable movie is Black Panther. In the music industry, it's the same. Nigerian artists have signed with major American labels. And we see that Nigeria is the fastest growing entertainment and media market industry in the world. Every year, 150 million viewers watch more than 2,000 films produced in Nigeria, far outpacing Hollywood. So I don't dare to say that Nollywood is stronger than Hollywood, but that's just the numbers. And at the source of this African soft power, we undoubtedly find the demographic dynamic. You know that, all of you say that. We have a generation born with the largest digital revolution in the world, with the mobile telephony market and mobile banking, cryptocurrency. And that's why the soft infrastructure has become so strategic and so important. Unfortunately, this industry is still underfunded, less than 1% of the continental GDP, and that's why it's important to develop this and to link this new investment to this sector with a deep reform of the international financial system.
Thank you very much. Dr. Moss, and I will be transitioning the gavel over to Representative Sherman.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to the chairman and ranking member. Really honored and thrilled to be here, especially with some old friends. So why does energy matter to U.S. leadership in Africa, and why do I personally work on energy? The answer to both of those is the same. Because Africans need a lot more energy than they use today, and energy is one of America's greatest strengths. When I served in the State Department, I was struck by how often our closest African allies wanted help attracting investment in infrastructure. That's why I started working on energy poverty when I returned to private life, and that's why we started the Energy for Growth Hub, which is a nonprofit research network dedicated to building a high energy future for everyone. So let's start with the scale of the opportunity. Sometime in the next 25 years, Nigeria will be larger than the US in population. Yet today, the average American uses nearly 100 times as much electricity as the average Nigerian. It's 100 times. That is a lot of unmet energy demand out there, and that's just Nigeria. Getting Nigeria to just say, the average Nigerian to just say 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, this is what we call the modern energy minimum. That would take increasing Nigeria's installed capacity by 15x. So energy is a massive opportunity for the US to be a serious partner and to work with our African allies to meet one of their fundamental needs, to promote US technology, and to provide an alternative to Russia and China. But I fear that we are failing miserably to seize this opportunity. And one of the great things about leaving public life and becoming a private citizen is you get to say exactly what you really think and believe. And I'm going to take that opportunity today. So one example of us failing miserably is what's happened lately to Power Africa. Power Africa was President Obama's signature Africa initiative. It successfully helped build power plants and connect millions of people. And Power Africa showed that US initiatives can work when you have clear goals, an array of tools, and a dedicated coordinator with a budget. But the last 6 years have shown what happens when you draw all the wrong lessons. First, the Trump administration tried to copy Power Africa on the cheap. Copycat initiatives were launched in Asia and Latin America, but with no new resources and none of the coordinators' capabilities. And no surprise, both were failures. Then the Biden administration made big promises to take partnership with Africa seriously, but has seemingly left Power Africa to wither. It's been largely starved of budget and subsumed under the still amorphous Prosper Africa. Worse, instead of Power Africa's original mandate, which was to respond directly to Africa's energy needs, Power Africa has just become another climate initiative. With the EU now declaring natural gas as green and Europe turning its coal plants back on, it is no longer tenable for the US to treat Africa differently by pressing the continent to forego using its own natural gas for power, industry, fertilizer, and cleaner cooking. In Africa, this is obviously seen as hypocritical, and our policies are increasingly frustrating for African leaders. The Biden administration is also whiffing on the interagency lessons from Power Africa. The White House just announced a new partnership for global infrastructure and investment. It's great that the White House and the G7 are talking about infrastructure investment, but PGII has no clear goals, no new resources, no new tools, and it relies on the dreaded whole of government. PGII actually creates a labyrinth of interagency committees. There's a coordinator who's supposed to corral 13 departments and agency heads, but has no budget and no real authority. And in my opinion, there is zero chance that this will work. Instead, PGII, announced with fanfare, is likely to be yet another source of frustration for our African allies. So what should the US do instead? One, we should stop treating Africa's energy security as secondary. Africans will, of course, take advantage of low-cost wind and solar, but many countries will want to use some of their gas at home, and they'll need infrastructure to do that. The good news here is that there is no plausible scenario where Africa's use of natural gas matters to global emissions, none whatsoever. So we should stop the climate theater of pretending that we're fighting climate change by banning and restricting downstream gas finance in the poorest countries. It's not helping the climate, and it's hurting real people. They need reliable power, they need jobs, fertilizer, and cleaner cooking fuels. Number two, let's fully fund Power Africa. It deserves a line item in the budget and should be fully staffed and resourced as originally envisioned. And third, let's think bigger. We can make Power Africa better and more fit for today's purpose by turning it into an African Energy Progress Fund. In many countries, generation is no longer the big bottleneck. It's transmission, utility finances, integrating new technologies like storage, and integrated planning. If we are serious about partnering with Africa and accelerating the global energy transition, we would turn Power Africa from a niche initiative focused on individual projects into a wider fund that can work across the energy sector to partner on building a low carbon energy systems that can meet Africa's full energy needs of the future. Indeed, an African Energy Progress Fund would far better serve US environmental, development, and national security goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we've heard from all of our witnesses, and unexpectedly, they've asked me to chair the meeting here for a while. So I will recognize myself for 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Moss. You say that the United States is preventing Africa from using its natural gas, et cetera. Is this just that we're not providing concessionary financing to help Africa do this? Or is there some way in which we are sanctioning, penalizing, or threatening action against Africa if they simply use their own resources, knowing that we just had our president go to Saudi Arabia and politely ask the Saudis to use their resources on the world market? You've accused the U.S. of preventing Africa. Are we simply failing to facilitate?
Thanks for that question. And I think, seeing the president in Saudi Arabia is exactly indicative of some of the frustration that we're hearing constantly from African leaders about the U.S. position. So there's one thing is that the U.S. has been advising African governments to skip over fossil fuel infrastructure and jump straight to renewables only. I chaired a public roundtable.
Well, they don't have to take our advice.
I know. I'm talking about the messaging.
We've got Mr. Buzz. We've got a very limited time.
Yeah. Okay. On the financing, infrastructure in Africa, especially downstream infrastructure, not the upstream exploration and production, the downstream infrastructure for power plants, for fertilizer factories, for the off-takers, that requires, in many markets, development finance, which we can provide through DFC,
so
through the
we're
World
not,
Bank or others, and that has been being restricted and treated differently for low-income countries than for regular middle-income countries.
Okay, we're not providing the help because we're not providing concessionary financing. Somebody trying to develop oil in Texas doesn't get the kind of bank financing and that you're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing what you suggest, but to accuse the United States of preventing as if we're, sanctioning Africa I think goes a bit too far. I'll ask our other witnesses, does China provide aid or only a commercial relationship? Do they, to what extent does China do something that has no benefit for China, is just there to benefit Africans? I don't know which.
Well, I can try to say something. This is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very quickly, China does both. It provides loans, but it also provides aid, just like many other countries do. And China looks forward. It's been trying to do both in African countries for a long time, building forward to the future and seeing the continent as a critical geopolitical ally for the future.
Thank you. China is the world's greatest contributor to global warming. The US and to a greater extent, the rest of the Western countries are doing a lot to combat global warming. Do Africans understand that? Does China get any blame for its failure to really do anything about global warming? I'll ask one of the other witnesses who hasn't spoken.
Sorry, Chair. The question is whether China gets the blame.
Yes.
No, the real problem is not there. The real problem is that there's no funding for Africa to adapt to climate change, irrespective of who the emitter is. There was $100 billion promised in Copenhagen for both mitigation and adaptation, and that has not been possible.
That is an interesting answer, but it seems like whether we do a good job in Africa or not, China skates free from any criticism, and America tends to get blamed, sometimes deservedly, sometimes not. The final point I'll make is, so our colleagues know I chair the Capital Markets Subcommittee, where we focus on private sector investment. And a lot of Americans are looking for ways to invest in, not just for return, but also to do good in the world. And part of that is to provide development aid to Africa. To what extent do we have American mutual funds that Americans can invest in that invest solely in sub-Saharan Africa? And I also want to mention to my colleagues that I would like to work with them on trying to get a fund in our TSP, the investment of all the federal employees, where instead of just having a global fund, federal employees could see their money invested just in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll ask our witnesses, are there enough conduits through mutual funds for those individual Americans who want to see their money invested in Africa?
That is for, maybe Ngozi, you want to take that?
No, go ahead, Donald, please.
Yeah, so the problem in Africa in terms of financing is simple as this, is that what we need are de-risking instruments and instruments which pull risks so that we can access private capital. This is where the money is. And the reason countries go to China is that precisely China provides those tools. So if the US or US-led institutions could provide more de-risking instruments, risk-pooling instruments, there will be many vehicles available across the African continent to do what we're saying. A number of large private equity firms in the US have tried this market. They have not been very successful. In fact, about 4 of them have exited in the last 5 years, simply because there have not been opportunities to do what you're saying.
Doctor, my time has expired, and I do think we need to look for ways to invest in Africa that doesn't involve the U.S. federal government spending money or taking risk, along with the situations where we do. And with that, I'll call, I believe, the most senior Republican is Joe Wilson. I'll recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Congressman Sherman. And indeed, this is bipartisan, very significant interest of members to be here with Congressman Sherman. What an honor, and Congresswoman Spanberger, and to be here with our other colleagues. In fact, very interesting, over the weekend, I saw an article about Reuters, which explained about the Trans-Saharan pipeline. And it fits right into what Congressman Sherman and Todd, you were talking about, and that is the development in Nigeria, working with Niger and Algeria to provide natural gas to Europe. And this would be to stop the intimidation and the blackmailing of Putin, of the people of the European Union. And so with the investment that's being proposed, $13 billion, there could be 30 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year provided from Nigeria through the Saharan pipeline. And gosh, that would be so mutually beneficial to the people of Africa. And so I hope everybody looks up this article from Reuters. I put it in the congressional record. It was so important to me that we have such a positive alternative to the blackmail that Putin is conducting today. Additionally, I found out there's, even Brad Sherman doesn't know this, there's another pipeline that's coming through Morocco that could have a great impact on being an alternative to the situation that we now have of blackmail from Putin. And so this would be, again, so mutually beneficial to Europe and to the people of Africa. A question I have for whoever would like to answer, and that is that Putin's war on Ukraine has threatened the global food supply and stability around the world. Malign actors seek to exert their influence across Africa and sow political unrest within developing democracies. In Libya, war criminal Putin has deployed mercenaries and military equipment in support of the warlord Khalifa Haftar. How does the global democratic community provide support to activists on the ground who are combating disinformation and undue influence by regimes like the CCP and war criminal Putin? What more can we do to help document human rights abuses against pro-democracy opposition and empower them in the uphill battle that they face? And I believe that actually worldwide we're in a conflict, and it's a conflict between democracies, rule of law, against authoritarian governments, rule of gun. And we just in the interest of the people of Africa and just worldwide, we need to address this, and whoever would like to answer, I'd be happy to hear.
Maybe Rama.
Yes, thank you for this important question. You know, Russia's influence on the African continent is not new, and we remember during the Cold War how so the Soviet Union was close to a part of African leaders. They helped them to support their independence in the 60s. I think this historical link, has a lot of impact in Russia's influence today in Africa. That said, we are in Africa, people are really concerned about the Sahel situation. I think that Russians have taken advantage of the messy situation in the Sahel area to advance its political agenda through the Wagner mercenaries. But, you know, nobody in Africa is expecting or is dreaming of the Russian political system or the Russian way of life. It's the same for China. The problem is not there. The problem is that it's absolutely critical to solve the problems where Western countries are involved on the African continent. For example, in the Sahel, it's a 20 years old war. And we know that this war has been caused by many factors, including the situation in Libya. And here again, Russians take advantage of these explanations to advance their own political agenda. And there's a link between what's going on in Kiev and what's going on in Bamako. So for me, the question is not about Russia or China, but about Western policies to Africa. And I think the best answer to provide here is to adjust or reshape or maybe better craft those policies to Africa. And you will see from there that they will back off from the African continent because, like I said, young African people, they don't dream of the Chinese or the Russian system.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. I believe our last questioner is Abigail Spanberger. Although I saw a flash of, oh, there's Chairman Meeks. He's back. I'll turn it back to Chairman Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Thank you for standing in. And I'll defer to our distinguished member from the state of Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, and I'll go after the last witness. Ms. Spanberger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, that's very kind, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much. To our guests and our witnesses, I really appreciate you participating in this roundtable. I find them to be so valuable. I would like to open this general question up to everyone, but Dr. Moss, if you could perhaps begin, I would appreciate it. Certainly in some of the introductory comments and some of the other questions, we heard overall discussions about China's active investing in Africa and how that investment frequently comes with strings attached that really, those strings do not deliver for the local people or the economies. Dr. Moss, you were fairly critical, and I appreciate a critical eye towards any program and any attempt that we are trying to make for good investments. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to whole of government initiatives intended like Prosper Africa, where we're trying to leverage the services and resources of government agencies to increase two-way trade and investment between the United States and Africa. And if you could provide kind of an overall assessment of the effectiveness, and certainly in your opener, you spoke about some of the challenges that we see on the ground, but can you just dive a little bit more into your perspective of what can be most effective, what can be done to connect U.S. businesses and African economies, companies to the benefit of the economy, and certainly, especially when we look at what other countries might be doing in the region. And I'd like to start with Dr. Moss, but I welcome any other comments.
Great, thanks for that question. And just to answer Representative Sherman's very specific question, no, there is no current retail product for a regular American to invest in African equities. That doesn't exist right now. On the question of China and the US response, so the starting point is that China provides a package deal. If you're an African leader, you're not just getting, let's stick to the power sector, a power plant. You're actually you can get a package that's a power plant with the transmission lines, with an industrial zone, maybe with a fuel contract, and it all comes with, packaged with finance. It's very attractive and it's fast. And so I would not overstate the strings attached. Some of those strings are seen as beneficial to African governments. And a lot of Chinese investment is in areas that the US is not now and never will be investing. So we should recognize that Chinese investment is actually quite welcome in most parts, if not all parts of Africa.
Yeah. Could you give, just for reference, could you give an example of the type of investment that's available from the Chinese that wouldn't be from the US?
Well, a lot of the roads and construction contracts come with cheap finance, and we just aren't doing that. Large hydro also. The U.S. does not build, and in fact opposes large hydro projects at the World Bank and at the African Development Bank. And the Chinese are building a lot of large hydro facilities. So, but the issue, in my view, and this comes largely from my experience at State, is that the interagency is structured, it's so fragmented and structured in a way that the incentive is not to collaborate across institutions. And the only way that it works, as I believe we saw with Power Africa, is that you had a dedicated team and a coordinator who wasn't just a figurehead of the White House, but actually had tools to encourage and incentivize collaboration to get specific projects done. That's what I'm seeing missing from the new G7, which is a lot of layers of, it's going to create a lot of meetings, and I would suspect not a lot of projects. And so I'd be happy to talk in more detail with you or your staff about some of those issues, which we're thinking about how to make that work better in the energy sector, and that would apply more broadly.
Okay. Thank you. And I think I am actually over on time. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to say thank you for giving me your time, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Let me again, I want to thank the witnesses. I'm reading your testimonies, etc. I have a series of questions that I want to ask. My first question is, what is your sense of why we as an international community have failed to marshal the kind of strategy and policy initiatives that we see in the context, for example, of the Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific? And how do you think we can correct that course? I'm directing that to anyone, but maybe Dr. Ngozi, you might want to tackle that first.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Meeks. And I really want to thank and commend you for this session and for your interest in bringing a more strategic approach to Africa. I think I want to mention something that Donald Kaberuka said during his talk, which is very important. Africans do have a way forward. They do have a strategy that can be built on. We have the Africa 2063 strategy, which has a vision for how to move the continent forward. It goes into things that Africa wants to do, how it wants to industrialize, how it wants to add value to its products, what it wants to do about its human resources, and so on. I think the best way forward strategically is if the US could work with African leaders and the African Union to actually try to build on that Africa 2063 strategy. There's a lot of meat in there, and it would be akin to what they're trying to do with the Indo-Pacific and with other areas. This would be coming from the Africans, taking from their strategy, and then trying to say, how do we support them to do this? Which are the sectors? We have so many opportunities on the continent now, in spite of all the problems. And all of us panelists have said it. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a 1.4 billion person market for US companies that they have not yet taken advantage of. And part of the 2063 strategy is to actualize this, put this in place, then build manufacturing sectors or industries, that can add value to, and then export within the continent and also outside. I'm in trade. And I know that with concerted action, Africa can double its exports, a share of trade to the world within the next decade if we came together with the US on some of these actions. Can I just mention one last thing? One glaring opportunity now is the move by the US to look at secure trade, to build resilience in supply chains. by trying to deconcentrate supply chains away from East Asia, from China and other areas? Well, one very important way to do that is to bring some of these supply chain investments to Africa, to where there is a proper environment to receive them, and to build a manufacturing sector in these countries. So this is a real opening now. And the perception of risk of investment in Africa by American companies, I think, is way beyond what the real risk is. And so we need to find ways to be able to persuade them to invest. So build on what we have, build on Agenda 2063, and we can find a way forward together.
Thank you for that. And building on that, Dr. Yade, Ambassador Yade, COVID seemed to have disrupted those global supply chains that Dr. Ngozi just talked about. And that on top of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which exacerbated global inflation and food insecurity, the global supply chains and manufacturing infrastructure being relocated at rapid pace, and prioritizing nearshoring, and a term that I think that Secretary Janet Yellen used, friendshoring. I believe there is an important opportunity for African countries to be more important actors in, and I think that that's what Dr. Ngozi was saying, in the global supply chains and manufacturing. How can the U.S. partner with Africa to make this happen?
This question is very, very important. What's the value added coming from Americans? I think that the Westerns and particularly the United States have something neither China nor Russia can offer to Africans. It's not about investments, because the race on investment is crazy. There are so many global and regional powers competing with each other on the African continent. But I really think that there's something China cannot provide, and only the US can. It's the access to the international financial system that will help Africans to address their own problems. And their own problems are systemic now. I mean, when you think of the pandemic, migrations, climate, all these problems are systemic now and have a worldwide impact. And the problem is Africans are forced to count on the rest of the world to solve these problems, giving the impression they are not able to do it, to tackle these problems, but they would like to do it. Remember when Macky Sall, chair of the African Union, said on multiple stages, international stages, including in Sochi, that the Africans need to be trusted and they need to share the burden of these global problems. And that's why it's so important for them to have access to the international financial markets. It can be through, the creation of a Pan-African credits rating. It can be, they could share the multilateral governance, the G20, for example, the Security Council, at the UN. There are so many ways to drive, to bring Africans at the table of the decisions so they can be actors of their own destiny. And I think that's the most important asset in American hands.
Thank you. And finally, let me ask, and I know I'm out of time, but I'm the chair, so I guess I can ask my question anyways. Mr. Kaberuka, how can we strike an appropriate balance that ensures African partners have the agency required to lead and take full ownership, while international partners play a supporting role?
Thank you, Chair. Let me say something which I think most of my colleagues have mentioned, which I think is important. There are 4 issues which will be critical in Africa in the next 10 years. 1, the demographics. 2nd is the energy transition. 3rd is digitalization. And 4th, peace and security. Let me just pick energy transition. You know, the demand for copper in the next 10 years will go from 25 million metric tons to 50 million metric tons. And a lot of that will come from Africa. What we don't want is to repeat the mistake we have done in the past of exporting raw copper. We want to transform that copper in Africa, add value in Africa, create jobs in Africa. So anyone prepared to work with us to participate in the energy transition, in the digitalization, while adding value in Africa and creating jobs, that is a real partner we need. And the US can do this. Whether it is copper, cobalt, where Africa has 85% of all the cobalt reserves available. And these are minerals which will play a key role in the energy transition. And so, if, as Ngozi was saying, in the context of Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the US said, look, we're going to be your partner in energy, in value addition, in digitalization. That would be a win-win for everyone. Let me just add one fun point, Greg, which you know very well. And this is something which Rama mentioned about peace and security. For a long time, the approach to helping Africa with peace and security has been sending in foreign peacekeepers funded by the United Nations. That is no longer working, and it will not work in the future. African countries want to keep peace and security in their own countries, in their own regions themselves, but they lack funding. And we have worked with the Obama administration to try and see how actually the African Union, ECOWAS, and regional organizations can access funding from the UN to be able to build capacity to maintain peace and security in Africa. That would be a hugely important contribution to creating stability, which thereby makes jobs possible. So stability, we can do it together. Digitalization and energy transition, value addition, building on what Africa has and avoiding the mistakes of the past. Greg, you are muted.
Sorry about that. I said, I understand that Representative Stamberger may have an additional question, but I want to check first with Mr. Wilson, because I hear the bells are ringing, so we've got a little left time, but I want to take advantage of this panel. Mr. Wilson, is there anything else that you would like to ask?
I believe Congressman Dan Muser has been with us too.
Oh, I
from
didn't
Pennsylvania.
Is Congressman Muser on? Councilman Muser? I recognize Representative Muser for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like all of you, I appreciate this hearing very much. Certainly learning a lot, getting some various views, and it's just so very important for the work that we need to do collectively, globally, for our trading partners, our allies, and for the great people of continent of Africa. The energy issue is very important. We've got to be smart about it. You know, we have some not necessarily competing views offered, but I think some realistic outlooks. Of course, we want the most responsible energy development possible. Yet at the same time, it needs to be affordable, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be retrievable, it needs to have, it needs to be expeditious. So that certainly does mean tapping into natural gas, along with the investments that take place in renewables. But we can't, we can't put ideology, long-term desires over the relatively immediate needs of people. So I really appreciate this conversation and the folks that are speaking to us. Thank you all very, very much. So and Mr. Chairman, I'll just offer, if there's next time there's an opportunity to visit in a CODEL with the Foreign Affairs Committee, boy, I'd certainly welcome that opportunity. So may I ask, and I really like the conversation on what you were bringing up, Mr. Chairman. It's where have we gone wrong here? What are some of the mistakes made? What better strategy should we have to be supportive and to, frankly, in many cases, outdo or be as competitive or as much of an investment friend or better investment friend than other countries, particularly China. So, I'd ask, I'll just put it out there for the panel, if you would elaborate on that a little bit more. What do you, from where you are, where you're right on the ground there, you know what's best for your nations. What would you like to see, realistically speaking, United States, the type of strategic plan the U.S. has to complement what you're already doing in your development, in raising the economic levels and all for and national security levels for your country? What would you be doing if you were sitting in Chairman Meeks' seat, or for that matter, the president's seat? What should the U.S. be focused on, and what would a three-part plan be that our committee would not just support but work off of and execute on? I offer that to the panel.
All right, colleagues, can I go first?
Start?
Okay, Ngozi, you go first. I'll go after you.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Ngozi, you start.
Okay, well, thank you so much for those comments and that question. I think the first place to start is convincing Africans that the US really does mean to come in and invest on the continent, that it's not about aid, it's about supporting Africa's own strategy and priorities. So I think there's an opportunity for dialogue with leaders. I hear there might be an opportunity later on in the year. This would be a good specific chance to tell African leaders, we want to support your priorities. And they can tap into the strategies that have already been done for the continent. I mentioned Agenda 2063. Both all the panelists, all of us have talked about the need for infrastructure. It would really be very important if we could get more US private sector investment into infrastructure. There are ways to do this by overcoming the high perception of risk, which I think is too high. If you look at some of these projects, some of them have a healthy rate of return, even up to 30% in some cases. So that would be where to start. Infrastructure is so critical. Todd talked about it. Donald, everybody, Rama. So that would be one. The other is to bring in US businesses. To let them have a dialogue with African businesses. We have very, very important and significant private sector in Africa. Africa is investing in Africa itself. If you look at investments in Nigeria, you see a lot of them come from South Africa. If you look at investments in South Africa and other African countries, you see Nigeria and others investing. So these established business people and the younger ones that are coming up in the tech sector, why can't we put them together with US businesses so that they can actually talk to each other and be able to form partnerships that can deliver in the digital space, that can deliver in infrastructure, other types of infrastructure? And lastly, I would like to suggest that there are specific opportunities, as we said before, for actually deconcentrating supply chains and locating them in Africa, and talking to Africans about what are your priorities in these areas? How can we work to friendshore with you? I think pharmaceuticals is a very big area that could be done. Fertilizers, there's so many others. These are, I'm talking specifics now. I don't want to talk, kind of theory. So let me leave it there. The opportunities coming up now where we could bring business to business, government to government, support Africa's own strategy and Africa's youth, especially in the tech sector.
That's great, Doctor. That's a very specific plan. I appreciate that. Dr. Kaberuka, you were going to mention?
Thank you.
Real quickly, because we're out of time and we got to go.